There is an entire country where the very first resident in history moved in after the printing press was invented. Not a village, not an island, a whole country. It's called Cape Verde. 10 islands off the west coast of Africa. Gorgeous beaches, 500,000 people, and for almost all of human history, its population was zero. Think about how strange that is. Humans get everywhere. We crossed oceans in canoes. We settled the frozen Arctic. We looked at the Sahara Desert and said, sure, home. By the 1450s, Machu Picchu was already standing. The Forbidden City was finished. Oxford had been teaching for over 300 years. Students were already complaining about essays. And this whole time, 10 perfectly usable islands sat in the Atlantic Ocean, completely empty. No towns, no tribes, no people, nothing. So today, who finally found them? What was living there instead? And how did an empty rock become the birthplace of a whole new culture? Buckle up. First, the setting. Cape Verde is a horseshoe of 10 islands, roughly 350 miles off Senegal in West Africa. That is very, very far past swimming distance. And before humans, the place ran on a skeleton crew. The only land mammals that ever made it out there on their own? Bats. Because bats have wings. That was the whole mammal department. Bats. Plus sea turtles nesting on the beaches, some lizards, and a lot of extremely relaxed seabirds. Paradise if you're a turtle. For thousands of years, the most dramatic event on these islands was a turtle laying eggs slightly to the left of where she laid them last year. Now, could someone have visited before? Maybe. Some historians wonder if Phoenician sailors, Arab traders, or West African fishermen ever got blown out there and looked around. But that is pure speculation. Nobody has ever found a single trace. No tools, no bones, no campfires. As far as the evidence goes, no human had ever lived there, ever. Which brings us to the 1450s, the golden age of Portuguese exploration, when ships started crawling down the African coast. And things got weird immediately. Enter Alvise Cadamosto, a merchant from Venice sailing for Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator. His job? Sail south, trade, and write everything down. Basically a travel blogger with a boat. Cadamosto later wrote that in 1456, a storm grabbed his ships near the African coast and shoved them west, way out to sea. And there, surprise, islands, empty ones. He anchored at one and named it Boa Vista, meaning good view. He checked another, nobody home. Eventually he sailed off. The first European sighting of Cape Verde. Allegedly. Because here's the problem. Cadamosto's story comes from Cadamosto. He wrote it years later, in his own memoirs, where he is, shockingly, the hero of everything. Portugal's official records tell it differently. Royal paperwork from 1460 credits the discovery to Antonio de Noli, a captain from Genoa. So that's the king's documents versus a memoir. And then there's contestant number 3. Diogo Gomes, a Portuguese explorer, swore that he was the first man to actually land on Santiago, the biggest island. Gomes even complained that while he was busy exploring, de Noli raced back to Lisbon ahead of him, told the king first, and grabbed the reward. Rude. Effective, but rude. So yes, 3 grown men spent years fighting over who discovered islands that contained, and I cannot stress this enough, bats. The grand prize was bats, except there was a real prize. The king handed de Noli the captaincy, the job of running the islands. The man who filed his paperwork first became Cape Verde's first boss, and in 1462, it finally happened. Settlers landed on Santiago and founded a town called Ribeira Grande. And with that, Cape Verde got its first residents in history. Let that sink in. The year humans first lived in Cape Verde was 1462. The Gutenberg Bible had already been printed. Leonardo da Vinci was about 10 years old. Ribeira Grande wasn't just Cape Verde's first town. According to UNESCO, it was the first permanent European colonial town in the tropics. Anywhere on Earth. The first settlers were mostly Portuguese, many from the south of Portugal, plus Genoese families like de Noli's. Life was hard. The islands were dry, windy, and allergic to rain. Everything had to come by boat. The first goats? Boat. The first cattle? Boat. The islands got their first farm animals the exact same way they got their first people. Which brings us to the name. Cabo Verde means green cape, and these islands are not green. They are basically the Sahara's beach vacation. So who picked the name? Nobody, really. The islands are named after Cape Verde, a genuinely green peninsula on the African mainland near Dakar, the westernmost tip of the continent, which Portuguese sailors named in the 1440s. The islands just inherited the name because they are nearby. That's like being called Mr. Tall your whole life because you live next door to a tall guy. Even Christopher Columbus was annoyed. He stopped by in 1498 and wrote that Cape Verde was, his words, a false name, because he saw nothing green in them. That is essentially a one-star review from 1498. Misleading name. Saw no green. Could not buy cattle. Would not anchor again. Signed, Christopher C. But now we need to talk about why this dusty little town mattered so much. Look at a map. Cape Verde sits right where the Atlantic sea routes cross. Ships heading from Europe down to Africa, or from Africa across to the Americas, sailed right past it. And in the brutal new economy of the 1500s, that location meant one thing. Ribeira Grande became one of the great hubs of the Atlantic slave trade. This part is not funny, so I'll just tell it straight. Thousands of enslaved people from the West African coast were brought through these islands every year. Held, taxed, and shipped across the ocean. UNESCO calls the town an essential platform of that trade. So Cape Verde's story carries a painful paradox at its core. The country's very birth is tangled up with one of history's greatest crimes. But something else was born here too. On these islands, African and European people, languages, food, and music collided. And out of that collision came something brand new. UNESCO calls Cape Verde the birthplace of the world's first Creole society, a culture that did not exist anywhere on Earth before. It was invented here, on islands that had been empty. They even built their own language, Creole. It is the oldest Portuguese-based Creole still spoken today. And it is widely considered the oldest living Creole language in the world, full stop. Today, roughly 7 in 10 Cape Verdeans are of mixed African and European descent. The empty islands never had a first people, so they created one. Meanwhile, all that trade wealth made Ribeira Grande shiny. And in the 1500s, if your town was shiny and sat near the sea, you had a pirate problem. In 1585, Sir Francis Drake showed up with a fleet and around 1,000 men, captured the town, and ransacked it. England's most famous sea dog, raiding little Cape Verde, but the treasure had been hidden or shipped out. So Drake, national legend, terror of the seas, left with wine, olive oil, and wheat. He came for gold, he left with groceries. The town built a big stone fort in response. It did not matter. In 1712, a French privateer named Jacques Cassard sacked the place so thoroughly he took the church bells. The church bells! That is not plunder, that is spite. After that, the town faded, and in 1770, the capital officially moved down the coast to Praia, where it still is today. Old Ribeira Grande got a new name, Cidade Velha, literally, the old city. And in 2009, UNESCO made it Cape Verde's very first World Heritage Site. And the visitor guest book of these islands? Ridiculous. Vasco da Gama stopped by. Columbus stopped by to complain. And in January 1832, a 22-year-old named Charles Darwin showed up. Cape Verde was the very first landfall of the Beagle Voyage, the trip that changed science forever. The ship meant to stop at Tenerife first, but Tenerife feared cholera and turned them away. Darwin poked around the tide pools of Santiago and found octopuses that changed color. He was thrilled. He wrote to his old professor, "I may have discovered something new." His professor's reply, gently, "Everyone already knows octopuses do that." Imagine your first week at your dream job and your big discovery is common knowledge about octopuses. But on those same rocks, Darwin studied the volcanic cliffs, and later said that is where he first decided to write a book on geology. Cape Verde low-key launched Charles Darwin, and the islands still do dramatic things. On Fogo Island, there is an active volcano. Inside its giant crater, inside it, sit 2 villages. People live in the volcano. In 2014, it erupted, and slow-rolling lava buried most of their houses. Everyone got out safely. And then, once things cooled down, they moved right back in and rebuilt. On top of the lava, so humans ignored these islands for all of history. And now some humans refuse to leave the inside of an active volcano there. We contain multitudes. Cape Verde became an independent country on July 5, 1975. Today it is home to over 500,000 people, world-famous music, and a language nobody on Earth had heard before the 1400s. From 0 people, while the pyramids, Rome, and Machu Picchu came and went, to a nation that had to invent itself completely from scratch. And did. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. because the truth only gets weirder from here. See you in the next one.